Halloween over? Did I miss it? The Queer Legacy of Frankenstein.
It's alive!
So, I've made it pretty abundantly clear at this point that I'm a fan of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's seminal 1818 novel and the many, many film adaptations of it. A deeply affecting story about the creation of artificial life and the tragedy of abandonment. I've talked about it a few times, and I'm going to keep talking about it, and none of you can stop me. Because when a story is as influential and long-lasting as Frankenstein, there are a lot of things that you can talk about with it. And today, we're going to be getting nice and queer with it. I'm going to delve into both the novel itself and some of its film adaptations to see just how much we can read queer themes into this story and its characters. There are a lot of hidden depths to Frankenstein, and this is just taking the time to focus on one of them. Reading queerness into a text that doesn't have anything explicitly queer in it is nothing new and has definitely been done before with Frankenstein. So why am I choosing to talk about this? Because it's interesting and I want to. I don't have to explain myself to you. Although I do need to explain this. Some clarifications.
In the name of God!
Before we get into the meat of this thing, I need to quickly clarify that anything I'm reading into this story is not necessarily what Mary Shelley meant when she wrote it. We have no way of knowing what she actually meant from this story since she's not around to tell us, having been dead for 168 years and all. But fortunately for us, the author is also dead figuratively as well as literally, so we can read whatever we want into it. And what we want is some queer stuff. And when I say queer stuff, I'm using it as a kind of nebulous term for anything LGBT+. It's usually going to be by subtext and inference, but I'm not going to point that out every time I do it because it will get really old really fast. And what the subtext most points to in this novel is homosexual. Because, well... Part 1. Victor Frankenstein is in the closet.
Crazy am I?
So, in a queer reading of Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein is a closeted homosexual man. There are a number of factors that this reading is drawn from, like how he displays much closer relationships to men than with women. Take for example his reaction to the death of his childhood friend Henry Clerval, falling into months-long illness out of shock and despair, compared to that to the death of his wife Elizabeth, where he just basically gets on with it. He's been married to Elizabeth because it's what is expected of him. He's clearly not that into it. And then there's the whole thing of him wanting to make a man. For what possible reason could he want to do that? To bang it. It's to bang it. It's for banging. So he's gay, but he needs to hide it deep within himself. In the time that the novel was written and set, homosexuality wasn't just taboo, but illegal. The crime of sodomy was punishable by hanging up until 1861. So, if Victor is attracted to men, then he has to hide that part of himself if he is to truly explore his desires. His very particular desires, digging up body parts to make himself a bangmate. It's at this point in the novel where he is the most driven and passionate, with the language being used to describe the creation of the creature being downright masturbatory. My limbs now tremble and my eyes swim with the remembrance, but then a resistless and almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seem to have lost all soul or sensation, but for this one pursuit! He makes himself a man because it's his hidden driving desire, but because of the legal and moral standards of the time, this is not allowed, so he has to hide it within himself. This secret desire to smash with a guy is what leads him to creating his creature in the attempts to make a perfect partner, since he can't exactly just go to the university and find one for fear of being found out and killed. But then, when his man is made and he might have to confront his own sexual identity, he becomes disgusted with the idea that he could have ever wanted to pursue that. He shares the bigoted views of his time, even while subconsciously wanting to be free of them. So the thought that he, a well-respected man of science, could possibly want something like that is repulsive to him. And he channels that repulsion into hatred for his creature. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardour that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart, unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created. From then on, he keeps this part of his identity buried deep within, denying even to himself that he could have created such a thing, because that is in no way his desire. He leaves the university and heads home and falls back into the role that society has deemed fit for him. He commits to going deeper into the closet than ever, which is not easy when the creature shows up and he has to confront his own desires and wants. Ultimately, him hiding himself like this leads to him being miserable and torn, and pushes those closest to him further and further away until he dies miserable and alone, having been punished for ever having those desires in the first place. But Victor isn't the only character that we can turn a queer critical eye onto. Part 2. The creature says trans rights!
Good.
The creature's story is entirely defined by tragedy. From the moment that he first comes into being, he is immediately rejected by his father figure. He never finds acceptance or kindness from anyone and is constantly hounded and hurt until he has to go into hiding. He sits on the sidelines of a family and gives them all his love and care, helping them when they need it. But when he shows himself to them, he's chased away before he even has a chance to explain himself. So, continuing on in the same vein of our queer reading, we have to assume that the creature is openly, visibly queer in a way that Victor isn't. Where Victor can pass in normal society as straight and get by, the creature very much can't. He is treated with nothing but monstrous cruelty and violence as a result of people's bigoted response to his appearance. I feel that the creature can be read as a representative of any minority group at a time of explicit oppression. He shows the very worst that humanity has to offer, and how relentless cruelty can break a person. Now, his response to this cruelty is to commit multiple murders, which isn't great, but that's the tricky thing when it comes to the creature. For all that he's sympathetic in a lot of ways, he's still portrayed as the monster of the story. Frankenstein is a novel that views the queer as societally abhorrent. From the moment that Victor gives in to his desires, he never stops being punished throughout the rest of the novel. No matter how much he goes back into heteronormativity, he cannot hide his guilt over what he's done. And the creature, who is the very embodiment of open queerness, is a murderer who enjoys the cruelty of his actions. Or at least, that's how Victor sees him. Victor, acting as the narrator of the text, only serves to further turn the creature into a monster in the eyes of the reader. I mean, he talks about him like this: the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy daemon to whom I had given life. He is the other, outside of what Victor knows to be acceptable. It's only in the section of the novel narrated by the creature that we actually see the tragedy of his story unfold. So we have a layered depiction of an oppressed character from both his own point of view and that of his oppressor. The tragedy of it is that Victor's version is given more weight. The oppressive societal views win and drive them both to sad ends. Through this reading, the story only becomes more tragic. But how does this reading translate across to other mediums? Part 3. A new world of gods and monsters.
You're wise in your generation.
For most of us, the novel isn't our introduction to Frankenstein. This story has lasted as a cultural touchstone largely because of its film adaptations, so how does queerness permeate some of them? Well, the obvious starting point here is 1931's Frankenstein and 1935's Bride of Frankenstein, directed by James Whale and starring Colin Clive and the only good Boris. Now, being made in the 1930s, these films are obviously not very explicitly queer. In fact, they kind of establish a standard of working very hard to make Henry Frankenstein look as heterosexual as possible. He's not called Victor in these, don't worry about it. Compared to his basic disinterest in Elizabeth in the novel, here she is significantly important to him. So much so that he allows people in to see him bring his creature to life purely because she is with them. And generally, once his madness has passed, he just wants to marry Elizabeth and move on with his life. This is something that would go on to inspire the ways that other filmmakers would work on this story in the future. I am Kenneth Branagh, and I am having sex with this woman. Elizabeth is also kidnapped to motivate Henry into action, giving him a chance to be the romantic hero that the 1930s needed him to be. His queerness is nowhere to be seen by design. The creature is similarly stripped of his queer identity. Instead of the intelligent, sensitive being who is hurt to the point of cruelly acting out against his aggressors, he's portrayed more as a childish figure. Here, he's hated because he hurts people. And he hurts people because he doesn't really understand what he's doing. He's still a tragic victim of abuse, but the framing of it works very differently. And when he does gain some semblance of intelligence in Bride of Frankenstein, it's hardly the eloquent musings on his own tragedy that he displays in the novel. Though there is undoubtedly more of his novel self that works through here, it's still overpowered by the image of the monster that has developed in the popular consciousness. In fact, the only queer-coded character to appear in these two films is Dr. Pretorius in Bride, played wonderfully by Ernest Thesiger. He's flamboyantly camp and shown to have decidedly unsavoury tastes. No one trusts him, he's sneaky and has no sense of morality. Unlike Henry, who is uncertain and troubled over the actions he's taken, Dr. Pretorius goes about everything he does with the utmost confidence, never experiencing guilt. It has often been the standard in films to portray a certain type of villain in this way. It sets him in stark contrast to our completely heterosexual hero, and was meant to make you subconsciously root against him. The queer character is being portrayed as alien and immoral, literally happy to be compared to Satan.
He's the very devil. Very bizarre, this little chap. There's a certain resemblance to me, don't you think? Or do I flatter myself?
Also that we won't think that Henry Frankenstein could possibly be gay in any way. So, if these two films are so interested in removing or villainising the queer elements of the novel, then why do I find them interesting to talk about in terms of their queerness? Largely in a behind-the-scenes capacity. You see, James Whale, the director of the two films, was unusually an openly gay man working successfully in Hollywood in the 1930s. He was a remarkable talent who clearly connected with the material in Mary Shelley's story and found a way to make it resonate with audiences the world around. Unfortunately, his career would be cut disappointingly short in the late 30s when a film he made that the studio recut to capitulate to the wishes of Nazis flopped. And no, I'm not kidding about the Nazis, that happened. The studio executives would use this as an excuse to push him onto nothing but low-budget B pictures until his contract ran out. And it's never been officially confirmed, but largely suspected that the real reason that they wanted to get rid of Whale was because he was gay, which honestly hardly seems surprising. The last days of Whale's life would later be reimagined in the 1995 Christopher Bram novel Father of Frankenstein, and its 1998 film adaptation, Gods and Monsters. Here, Whale, played to perfection by Ian McKellen, is a bitter, lonely man with failing health, haunted by visions of his past, who engages in a strange friendship with his new gardener, Clayton Boone, played by Brendan Fraser. This is a story inspired by the legacy of Frankenstein that truly embraces being about queerness and living with a queer identity at a time when it was still viewed with intense suspicion and distrust. Whale's life and career have been derailed by his sexuality, but he refused to ever give in and hide himself, and it's driven everyone away from him. He's alone but for his housekeeper and the new friendship he finds in Clayton. James Whale's sexuality in this film isn't played to make him monstrous or pitiable, it's simply one factor in the makeup of a really multifaceted character, which is something that he never got to put into his films himself. Unfortunately, this queer man's legacy on Frankenstein was to strip it of its queerness in the public consciousness. Which means that if we want to find a Frankenstein adaptation that really lives up to the queer influence of the novel, then we're going to have to look at something pretty subversive. Something that wears its queerness on its sleeve. Oh! Okay, that'll do. Part 4. Over at the Frankenstein place. The 1975 film The Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of the most interesting Frankenstein films there is. Based on the stage show of almost the same name, it's famously the brainchild of one-time host of the greatest TV show ever made, Richard O'Brien.
Will you stop the fans, please?
Obviously, it's not a direct Frankenstein adaptation, more a parody of 1950s B-movies, but it's still a story about a crazed doctor who makes a man. He just happens to be a bisexual transvestite played by Tim Curry in this one. Other than their choice in attire, the biggest difference between Dr. Frankenstein and Dr. Frankenfurter is that Frankenfurter doesn't feel the need to hide who he is. He is out, loud and proud, and willing to declare that he is making a man entirely for sex purposes. The titular Rocky Horror, played by Peter Hinwood. Rocky, this gold hotpants-clad muscle man who only knows how to be a thing for sex. His creation strongly mirrors that of the James Whale film, but with the image of the bandaged figure in the glass tank taken straight out of Hammer Horror. But then, there's no rejection. Quite the opposite, in fact. Frankenfurter happily sings about how much he likes his new man's hot bud, with a brief interruption to murder Meatloaf, before taking Rocky off to their nuptials. So, rather than any secrecy or shame over his actions, Frankenfurter makes it a party. He is not afraid to share his accomplishments with anyone who crosses his path. Just so happens that the people who cross his path on this occasion are Brad Majors and Janet Weiss, played by Barry Bostwick and Susan Sarandon. Brad and Janet are repressed in their sexuality, saving themselves from marriage and, in terms of physical affection, not sharing any more than a hug throughout the whole movie. But then, after a single night in the presence of Frankenfurter, he's seduced them both. Janet has slept with Rocky, and they're all performing a floor show in sexy lingerie and having a good time doing it. At the beginning of the film, the most warmth Brad is willing to show to another man is this lame arm punch. But with just a quick visit by Frankenfurter, he's quite comfortably into dudes. Where Frankenstein suppresses himself at every point, only becoming more miserable and alienated from those around him as the story continues, Frankenfurter lets people in and convinces them to abandon repression and give themselves over to absolute pleasure. Even Dr. Scott, the old-world academic, who totally jacked my only dance move, gives in and dons a pair of fishnets and heels. It never feels like the movie is judging any of these characters for giving in to Frankenfurter's magic like this. Sexual liberation in this way feels like a thing that these characters are happy to have received, a thing that they would be happy to go on doing forever if Riff Raff and Magenta, played by O'Brien and Patricia Quinn, didn't come and stop them. It's honestly no wonder this movie is connected with so many people in the way it has over the years. It's remarkable how, when you take the idea of Frankenstein and remove the shame and prejudice, add in some hot pants, high heels and songs that slap, you get this story about losing your inhibitions and giving yourself over to pleasure free from judgment. It's a movie that has staying power and value beyond just its cult status. It's just a shame that nowadays I have to try and separate it from the author because Richard O'Brien turned out to be a bit of a TERF despite being non-binary. I will still always celebrate this movie for its brilliantly open queerness. I just now want to find a story of Frankenstein that is sympathetic towards trans people, and oh look, I have one! Part 5. I'm coming for you, BookTube! Frankenstein is a new novel by Jeanette Winterson made of several disparate but complementary elements. It intercuts between two major stories, the primary focus being on the trans man Dr. Ry Shelley, who is in a relationship with the mysterious Professor Victor Stein, who is doing work at the forefront of uploading human consciousness into digital form, transcending our need for physical bodies. The other story is that of Mary Shelley at the Villa Diodati, writing Frankenstein. We are presented with two different characters who are both oppressed by the attitudes of the people around them. Mary by the bullish sexism of Lord Byron, Dr. Polidori and Percy Shelley, and Ry by the transphobic attitudes of almost every major character that he meets. But neither character allows themselves to be defined by the attitudes that people have towards them. This novel is interested in discussions regarding gender and how, in a transhuman future when we are all just digital consciousness, gender is probably going to become an irrelevant detail. I mean, if we don't have bodies anymore, then what even is a gender? Speaking as a cis person, I can't say how true this novel is to the experience of a trans person, but I did find it to be an interesting representation. Ry talks about living with doubleness in his gender. He is one thing, but also two things at the same time. Gender is a complex thing that people often view in oversimplified binary terms. This is reflected in characters like Ron Lord, the Welsh sex bot salesman, who can't seem to wrap his head around the idea that Ry is a man who just happens to have a vagina. So he asks a lot of inappropriate questions and misgenders him and dead names him, not really out of maliciousness so much as obliviousness. Running parallel to the willful ignorance that Ry faces are the deliberate attacks on her gender that Mary faces. She writes one of the most important novels ever to exist, but because she's a woman, she ends up living out her life in obscurity, struggling for money, never getting the recognition that she deserves. It does have a positive note, however, when, in later life, she meets Lord Byron's daughter Ada Lovelace, who is at the forefront of a new science. The barriers are being broken right before her eyes, and it ends up giving a sense of hope within all the melancholy. Frankenstein is a really remarkable novel that's daring, brave and unique, and is willing to question the ideas of gender and queerness. Jeanette Winterson has spoken in interviews about not really identifying as any given gender, and it's remarkable to see a creator who embraces their queerness and puts it into their work in a way that is supportive of identities other than their own. In conclusion,
We belong dead.
As a text, Frankenstein is an interesting one to read queerness into. The themes of repression, loneliness and cruelty resonate with the reader on a deep level and manage to work their way through into the different adaptations to varying degrees depending on the work in question. Though a lot of work was done to make these more palatable to a straight audience, a lot of queerness still managed to find their ways into the work, and which then inspired the work of queer creators. Hi. And there are other adaptations of Frankenstein out there that are willing to embrace the queerness of it and have fun with it. I didn't even mention Flesh for Frankenstein.
To know death, Otto, you have to fuck life in the gallbladder.
And whether the creators of those works were silenced or celebrated or just turned out to be a bit crap, we can still find joy and identity within their work. Now, if you'll excuse me, I just woke up from being in a spider web. I think I need to go to the doctor. So, I have made it pretty abundantly queer at this point. Abundantly queer. What a Freudian slip of the tongue. Thank you so much for watching my Halloween special about Frankenstein. I realised that it's a bit late. It was gonna be in time for Halloween, but then I got a cold that meant I couldn't record for like a week. So, whoops! If you would like to support my work, then there's a link to my Patreon in the etc. And I'll probably put the text up on the screen as well. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to my videos and exclusive content. It would be really nice if you do that. I'd appreciate it. I'm so bad at this. If you'd like to see more videos by me, then click up here to subscribe, or click up here to see my recent video about Into the Woods. If you'd like to see more LGBT content with a big emphasis on the T, then click down here to see Alice Pope Terry's fabulous Trans 101 series. They give really useful, bite-sized bits of information about trans issues, and it's just great. It's fantastic. Check her out, she is brilliant.